private
HOA,
property,
nothing.
private
Yeah.
party, yeah.
Well, I get it, I mean, I get the private party that parks in the street, you know, because they don't have a driveway that can accommodate that food truck, so they park it right in. So I think you're right, it has to be there for that, but if somebody's parking in their roundabout, in their, you know, Governor's Circle, it's not a big deal. Right?
That's up to you.
Yeah, well, that's.
I'm going to kind of push it back a little bit. Yeah, if you're on private property, then you're good. That's, the rule is, though, to be on the property, not to be out in the
But the
street.
problem is, it doesn't read that way. It says for locations on private property, no cost permit is required.
Right, but then right below are the standards for the food trucks in those, and it says property owner may sponsor, cater to property, own private property. And then associations can do this at, like, pool facilities and what have you, and then commercial ones shall not operate in residential districts except as listed above. So try to define some parameters around the general behavior that we see with the trucks, without being too heavy. This is really a light thing to be able to respond to
But
a
if it's
complaint.
in my driveway, it seems like I need a permit.
That's right, unless you want to take the permit out. That's what I'm saying. We can take the permit out. We don't, all we do is we'd say for locations on private property, no permit is required.
Yeah.
You know, instead of the no-cost permit, I can easily change it. So it's up to the pulse of the board.
No, I think it's on private property, there should be no permit. Well,
Okay. Is that the poll?
Yes.
if it's on my property, I don't want to have to go for a permit.
But if the guy, you know, pulls up in the street, you know, then,
That's not private property, though.
I know it, I know it, you know.
Then that's a violation.
And it's a violation, you know, and so, but he says it's for a private party, I'm not selling anything.
So I'm striking the word "a" between property and no cost. I'm striking "a" and I'm striking cost. So it would now read, for locations on private property, no permit is required for non-commercially sponsored events. So we're taking out the "a" and taking out cost. I try to write these so it's really easy. I'm really lazy.
Come to the right group.
Okay, so you're going to be getting this page every month from now till the end of the project, right, as we continue to refine this, right? Any other comments in that, on 15, on that?
The last half of that sentence then goes on to, talks about a permit fee. It seems like it's mixing issues now.
Which sentence?
The very same sentence is provided, however, permit fee may be established.
However, a permit fee may be established in the annual budget for commercially sponsored events.
The Village of Marvin's annual budget? What are we talking about?
In our fee schedule.
The annual budget for the town. You don't ever set permit fees in here.
Annual.
Set them in your annual budget. If you do it outside the annual budget, any kind of permits and fees like that now are required to go through an entirely different process than adoption of the budget. We have to invite them to a party, host them, explain it, and everything else. So always put your fees in your annual budget that sets tax rates and whatever
It
else
just
you do.
seems like it's in the wrong sentence now.
I want to make sure I understand which sentence we're looking at. The one that begins applications?
The very first sentence, the one that you're editing now, you keep reading it, we say there's no permit required, and then they say a permit fee may be established.
In the annual budget for commercially sponsored events.
Right, what he's saying is this is the
I'll edit it to read better.
Yeah.
The fees attached to, the fee,
I thought I was getting away with 2 words deleted, but I'll edit the whole thing and clean it up.
If you're going to have permits for commercial events, then say it in a separate sentence.
We'll break that out.
Yeah.
Okay. I usually pick up on stuff like that, Mr. Marino, when I'm sitting down and looking at it to make sure it reads well. So we don't have to wordsmith it completely in here, but essentially it's going to be pretty straightforward.
Rick, I did have, well, once we're done with food trucks, I do have a question on something in this chapter.
I'm sorry, say it again?
I said, if we're done with food trucks, I do have some, like a question / discussion for some in this chapter. It's the
Okay.
events of public interest on private property. And I know, like, throughout, like, for example, in the food trucks, it talks about like if it's a village-sponsored event, no permit may be required, all that other stuff. But what if it's, I guess my question is what if it's an event sponsored by the village on village property? Would that fall under the events of public interest on private property, or are we not going down that rabbit hole? I'm wondering, because right now our ordinance requires a temporary use permit for an event over 30 people. That it's ridiculous.
If you're hosting something on public property, you're the host.
So we're deeming that as
The
public.
town is the host. Let's suppose it's a public, an event of public interest on private property. I'm just gonna pick something, a blast from the past. 10 years ago, we were having these big color festivals. And there'd be a 30-acre site that would be hosting it, and there would be 30,000 people that would show up, and they would throw colored food starch in the air and run around, and then they would park all over the place, and then at the end of the day, it'd be over. And so we had to have some kind of standard. So that's an example of something that's drawing the public in. Pumpkin patch thing, like, for example, yeah, a Carolina Burning Man.
Is primarily be
Exactly.
the Firethorn fireworks show, was what this would kind of consist of.
They're drawing the general public in to an event on private property that is a temporary event. It's not something that's there it's not like the Renaissance Festival that's there for 3 months or whatever. This is something big on the weekend that's gonna be hosted at the farm or at the park, not the park, but some private property. Yeah. I try to write these fairly broad because you don't really know exactly what's coming at you next until you get the call. Right, Hunter? And when you get these calls and they'll ask a question, and so if everything is written really tight, a lot of things fall between the cracks. So I try to write them kind of general enough to where we can funnel them into one of these buckets. Okay? And that's what that is. So you don't need a permit process for the town to host a town festival on town park property. Unless you want to put some rules in there that we can run by the manager and see what's going on and see if they're okay with that.
No, I think I'm fine with that. I just wanted to clarify because, like I said, right now our ordinance, requires anything over 30 people, even if it's at the park, and a public hearing's required. It's a lot, and I don't know if that's in best practice because it's a larger.
Do you like it
event.
that way?
No.
Okay. All right. So this would replace that. Is that contained in your current UDO?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Then this would replace
Yeah,
that.
and I, like I said, I'm good with that because I think, for example, we didn't technically do one for Marvin Day, and we should have, but just because of the current ordinance. But we're about to do one for the next 3 events at the park, but in October, November, and December, just to meet ordinance requirements currently. And like I said, we have to do a public hearing. I've got to send mailing notices out, and it's extra work for a public event that is advertised to the public on village property. So.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I haven't heard of that one before.
Stupid.
Okay. Moving along, the next 3 articles, Articles 11, 12, and 17, you notice that you only received 12 and 17 tonight, and that is because it's been requested that we retain the current landscape provisions of your current UDO. And so there's a surgical operation going on back at my office to codify that into the new ordinance. To bring the numbering systems in consistently for references, and also to make sure we don't have conflicts, and to separate out issues that need to be separated out. So you'll see that Article 11 at some point along the process, because that one has been beating on me from the standpoint of formatting in that old document that was converted.
You don't have to, I just gave that for you as reference. I'm fine blowing it
No,
up.
I'm fixing it.
Oh, okay.
I'm getting it. It's just, it's one of those format wrestling matches. And I finally got it kind of working my way now, but I still have to go through word for word on everything to make sure it fits into this. So, so your landscape stuff, unless you have had difficulties with it in the past, is going to be carried over. Now, I am adding a little bit of language here and there where I see things that are missing, okay? And those will be highlighted, so you'll be able to easily tell what's in this, what I'll call updated version of your current landscape document, okay?
And just to clarify, I don't recall us kind of discussing that. I was good to rewrite it, but
I was thinking you wanted to keep landscape and the stormwater, so I did that to the stormwater.
the stormwater was one.
Right.
Landscape, our current one is awful,
Oh,
in my opinion. That's just because,
good, because I think it is too. But I thought you loved it, so I was not gonna,
no, I hate that thing. It's one of the most complicated 47 pages that I've ever looked at.
Set it on fire.
Reminds me of the little cartoon taped to our full-length mirror in our closet, my wife and I's closet, that was cut from the newspaper, and it's two clowns. And the female clown says to the male clown, as the male clown reaches for the doorknob on the door, "You're wearing that?" And my answer is always, well, no, I was just putting it on to see what it looks like. So thank you very much. I owe you. That was wonderful. I only have like 40 more pages of that 45-page monster to go because of getting started with the format wrestling. Oh, my gosh. Thank you. So I should have that whipped out and ready for you at your next meeting because I've got a pretty robust one that's pretty good. And ties in really well with the next article that you're going to see now, which is Article 12, parking. So these three are bundled together, 11 landscape and tree protection. And you may tell me, notice tree protection's at the back. You may say, oh, we hate trees. We want to let people cut all the trees down they want to, so we take out the tree protection, right? Okay. Well, I've had towns that did that. We won't name names. And then parking, and then the sign regulations. And the reason those three are grouped together is because they actually are the big three on non-residential, with the exception of architectural standards. They are the big three on non-residential development. Because if let's say that Chick-fil-A is proposing a parcel and a location for commercial development or whatever, and we've got our ordinance ready, and they're sitting there trying to figure out the site, well, their designer is going to be looking at everything outside the box. Their box is coming from corporate. So here's the box. We can put colors on it and finishes on it and stone and wood and all kinds of architectural amenities to the building, but generally they're going to send them a box and say, here's the store type we want at this location for these criteria. And so the designer's really going to be trying to take that square peg, I'll call it, and drop it into the site, which will be the round hole, right? And so what are the other variables? They are landscape, parking, and signage. So they will generally be working with those together. So I wanted to get you into this frame of mind because this is really the first little grouping outside of that early stuff that we hit last month, the general stuff about fences and driveways or the food truck temporary stuff. This is the first little grouping of articles that really start to create the look and feel and character of any non-residential development. And largely that will be non-residential. Some of it will apply in residential areas like no mass clearing of the site before you build your subdivision, that kind of stuff. But generally speaking, these three go together like the soup and the nuts. So skipping over 11 for now, and my apologies, Hunter, I misread you completely. But I'm so glad I did. Parking. I want you to think for just a second about parking in two different scenarios. The most common is commercial areas. You're parking at the CVS or you're parking at the restaurant or town hall, like this little parking lot that's here, right? And that's only part of the equation. Another big part of the equation is parking in residential scenarios, whether it's apartments and townhomes or whether it's the driveway of a house. A lot of people don't think about parking in residential subdivisions. They assume, well, the garage, the driveway, that's all good. Well, believe it or not, we actually have to have some foundation for some standards, or I highly recommend we have it. You're a pretty low-density community overall, so it's not going to be too big a problem, but if or when you do start exploring things with your heritage district and what have you, things are going to start tightening up a little bit. So these standards are written around high-density, medium-density, and low-density scenarios in residential, okay? You may say, well, we're never going to have high density. Okay, we'll take it all out. But if you ever amend your ordinance to allow some high density, or do a zoning map amendment or a rezoning that allows some high density, and you don't have those standards, then you're going to be wrestling with it, with that issue. So let me give you an example. At the bottom of the first page, I use this kind of typical sketch. This is in a higher, medium to low density situation, where you've got a driveway coming right up to the front of a house and a garage and what have you. And a lot of people don't realize that our parking requirements actually say that a single-family dwelling has to provide at least, in this draft, 2 parking spaces. Okay, if it's 3 bedrooms or more, it has to have at least 2 parking spaces. And a lot of people don't think about it when they say, well, the garage, that'll satisfy our 2. And then the Peloton shows up, and the boxes and the bikes and the bass boat and the everything else starts occupying the garage. And so now the 2 primary cars are sitting at the front of the dwelling. And then somebody calls 911. Okay? And this is, my parking standards actually came from watching first responders, trying to deal with cars parked in the front, and they couldn't get into a house with a gurney to help someone, to get someone out of the house. And so I watched them drive around the block and come in the backyard. They were on a corner lot, and they drove around the corner and came in the backyard and did it through the back door. So these standards are written around those public safety concerns, whether it's enclosed or not. So when you're reading these standards, it will refer to minimum required parking, whether enclosed or not, when you're talking about residential. Now that means it can be outside. They may not have a garage, or they may have a garage. But if they count the garage as their minimum required parking, then they have to keep it available for parking. If they have room on the lot and they want to have the garage to store their toys, that's fine, as long as they can still meet the standards for those minimum 2 required parking spaces, which are safely out of the way of obstructing a primary entrance to the dwelling. So when you're, and this is kind of a simple sketch, but it shows the parking spaces nudged beyond the conditioned space by a couple of feet, by about 3.5 feet. So if there's a little walkway coming off the front of the house, turning to the driveway or whatever, generally speaking, there's enough room. So that's where that's coming from, and I wanted you to know that. And it says that in the purpose statement, to enable emergency access to occupant areas, et cetera, et cetera. So we have standards for lots between 60 and 120 feet, and then we have standards for lots under 60 feet. That's your high density and your medium density. Then anything over 120 feet of lot width, you generally don't need to worry about it. There's so much room that it's not an issue, okay? You still have to have the 2 spaces, but they can be about anywhere, and you've still got plenty of room. So I wanted you to kind of understand a little bit about where that came from. You'll see some language in here that you'll think is fairly elementary, but I have seen ordinances written that had all kinds of great design concepts in them, but they failed to actually require that any of it be done. Simple ordinance writing, okay? I can think of a UDO that had to be amended the next month because they have beautiful landscape and parking standards for commercial development, but you weren't required to do it. They forgot one simple statement, okay? So I usually speak to that pretty close up front. Okay? You're gonna get into stuff about parking on streets, whether that counts, whether that doesn't count, if you get into a mixed-use development. Are y'all getting any inquiries here on any kind of density or mixed use or anything like that?
Yeah.
Yeah? What do you tell them? Go away or?
I mean, it's mainly properties within the Heritage District. I mean, like I said,
Okay.
nothing's being fully submitted yet,
So
but
that's,
there is that opportunity.
that's where this is gonna be the most important then, in the Heritage District. How big is the Heritage District, roughly, acreage?
123.
Yeah, that's pretty, 123, that's, it's about a fifth of a square mile, so, yeah. So anyway, I wanted to introduce it that way by giving you a little bit of feedback on it. This also has some language in it for you, and you can kick it back, not a problem, but I wanted you to see it when we're talking about commercial vehicles in residential areas. We'll get questions about that all the time. RVs, you'll look at this and say, well, you know, I think this is too stringent for the RV or not stringent enough. That's fine, but at least you've got some jumping off language that I want you to go through and look at for what you feel is important here. We've got some bicycle parking stuff for your things like Heritage District or other places where, let's say there's employers there, you know, the offices or something like that, they can actually reduce their parking a little bit by providing bicycle. I actually have that in my office. I have a bike locker in the office for bikes that's actually outside on the exterior of the building, but you open a door and there's where the bikes go. Parking oversized vehicles of a lot of different types. And then commercial begins on page 5. That's the non-residential development.
But before you switch over, on page 2, there can be no restrictions on residential street parking?
Yeah, there can be,
Talks
but
about a street parking schedule?
that's right. That's where you do that. We can talk about whether it counts as the minimum, whether we want to encourage it in the design or discourage it in the design, but to actually regulate it on the street, for a town to say no parking from here to here, or parking limitations like 2 hours, or speed limits other than 35, like posting at 25 or posting at 45. For a town to do any of that, they have to do it in what's referred to as a streets traffic and parking schedule. So you might, in that schedule, define Oak Street from block so-and-so to block so-and-so, that there shall be no parking or limit of parking, or, you know, whatever. Also with speed limits. Anything outside of 35, you have to adopt in a schedule. A lot of towns thought that, well, I'll make a motion that we put some signs out there and say no parking. That doesn't do it. You have to actually adopt it into your law, and then you go post a sign that represents what you've adopted into your law. The sign is not the law. The law is the law.
Yes.
No,
so we do.
You have a schedule?
We do. A prime example is if you go into Marvin Creek, I think it's like Redbud Trail. Anyways, we got complaints about, because right behind Marvin Elementary, that instead of, parents going through the drive-through line and other stuff, they were parking behind and on Redbud Trail and stuff, because there's a red twig, because there's a little trail connector from the school to Marvin Creek. And so we adopted by ordinance, put it on our parking schedule, and it's in our code of ordinance. I want to say it's like chapter 72, I think. But it literally says like no parking on Red Twig from the intersection of like Grove's Edge Lane to the end of the cul-de-sac. Did we adopt one for the preserve? I can't remember if we adopted that, but that was another one because once again, school bus decided to not start going in the neighborhood. They were dropping off at the front of the preserve. So, parents were then lining up, and it was creating a safety concern. And so we do, that's the current process. Basically, it's per request, and then council considers it, and if they approve it, they adopt it by ordinance, gets amended into our parking schedule.
So you're doing it correctly, and that's important to hear. What you're doing correctly. Yep, yep. Yep. Yeah, that schedule is what, I always refer to that schedule because that's the only way you can actually control parking or speed limits or things like no skateboarding on the sidewalk or golf cart provisions, all that stuff should be in that document, that streets, traffic, and parking. That's a specific piece of the puzzle in the state statutes. And that's one thing, let me stop right there for just a second, just to give you a little bit of perspective on the state statutes. This set of statutes is what pertains to land use and land development. The state of North Carolina really silos the state statutes. So you may have statutes over here that talk about things that we might relate to, but the authority to enforce is actually over here. We can't use the civil penalties for zoning-related things to penalize a parking violation. That's covered and enabled under that law. So the state of North Carolina is, I think it's pretty good, but it just means we have to make sure we tie things and weave things together.
Sorry to be a pain. The last 5 words of that same clause say, area specifically signed for no parking. I thought we couldn't just put up a sign.
You can't, but we want them to be specifically signed. We're saying that you can't in here as well, but this is not the law on the parking when you're in the right-of-way. The parking would be covered by that schedule.
So this is not the part, I don't follow that.
And you're reading 12.3.5?
1234.
12.3.4, parking on residential streets, parking is allowed along all residential streets in accordance with the adopted parking schedule. So what this is saying to the developer is that if a visitor comes to your house, they can
Oh, no, I
park in the...
understand that part. It was the
Right.
exception, except bike lanes within 8.
Yeah, except designated bike lanes within 8 feet of a driveway apron and within 15 linear feet of a hydrant and areas specifically signed for no parking. So what we're saying is that those areas, they can't count towards any approvable visitor parking, okay? And those are your critical areas that are normally covered in your street traffic and parking ordinance. Now, you may not ever have a bike lane, but you may. So this is almost, as much as anything, almost more of a courtesy to a developer who's putting together and trying to design. Otherwise, they have to run around to your different ordinances, okay? So anyway, that's what this one is about. There's a table in the back, starts on page 8, that has the parking space count for the different types of land uses, and we have a minimum and a maximum. Some towns only have minimums. A very few towns don't establish any minimum requirement. This draft has minimum and maximum, and there's a reason behind that. The minimum is to have adequate parking. The maximum is to prevent just these seas of asphalt that are excessive that you might see. Yes, sir? Not in a driveway. You're talking about in a home residential driveway? No, we've got a minimum of, as you'll see that first little list, there's residential. Let's say a typical 3-bedroom home is a minimum of 2.5 per unit, a maximum of 3 per unit. And you may decide you want 2. You may decide you don't want a minimum. Yes. Which the 5-bedroom home is going to be the same, 2.5 per unit. Per dwelling unit. Yeah. Yeah, they can, this is maximum parking spaces. No, you're down into, single-family detached, that's right. You got 2 per unit. on 3 bedrooms or more. Minimum 3. Not applicable, unless you want to change that.
And this is also, to clarify, when they're basically new development and the kind of, setbacks playing into this, all this stuff, but basically that the driveway has to be, be a minimum width, minimum size to at least park for the residents of that home. If they have more than that, I mean, once again, you're setting up a minimum.
Yeah.
Yeah, because there's no maximum.
Yeah, yeah, no maximum. That's right.
I remember a number of years ago, Charlotte went through, and I guess they added an ordinance, you couldn't park cars in the yard. Is that something that's,
We speak to permanent parking as being improved, like paved or something like that, okay? And then we speak to what we might call overflow parking, which is occasional, okay? And I've got provisions in here for that occasional overflow parking to be able to park on grass or something like that. Got a reunion at my house. I've got 20 kids coming over, something like that. Parking in the grass is not a problem in this draft, as long as it's not a permanent parking spot. When you start seeing that eroded out area where they're always parking the truck, that's what we're trying to avoid.
yeah, I think that probably came up when you were packing lots of people in a particular house, yeah.
It came up when Airbnb really kicked into
this
gear.
was
That was a driver for it in Asheville about 15 years ago when Airbnb became such a big thing and Asheville went nuts. And the biggest problem was people parking all over the yards because they were relatively compact neighborhoods, but then they'd have cars everywhere. So this is the draft of the standard. If you want to tighten it up, we can tighten it. If you want to
I
loosen
don't
it, we
know.
can dial it back.
I just remember it was a big deal in the news. God, it's gotta have been
Yeah.
No, I
15
mean,
years ago or more.
I think
that
when you
also
read through it,
include
you'll see
boats?
we've got it
Does that also
covered pretty well.
Does it include boats, trailers?
Look on page,
Right. The highlighted area is, everybody has a different thought on that. Some don't want them occupied at all. Some say, sure, but what about their in-laws when they come through from Florida? So but believe it or not, we don't police that ever. But when you get a complaint because somebody's been living in the driveway in the front yard for 3 months, we need some rule to point to say, okay, wrap it up. Okay. Do you like 30 days, or you think it ought to be about 10 days? Hey, I've slept in driveways myself, in my van.
I think if it's family, it's one of those things where it's like, as long as someone's not using it as a rental unit, I think this is fine. I was just trying to get some clarification on twice a year when they leave, but now I see what you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah, because that will happen from time to time. An HOA ordinance does not override this. An HOA ordinance can be more restrictive because it's a contract between the property owners. So if we say 30 days and an HOA says 10, then it's 10, but they're enforcing it, we're not enforcing it. We'll jump in and help when they hit 30,
Yeah, and
if this is the language you keep, yeah.
I'll add, I think I've actually just might have received it, just in my 2.5 years almost being here, one call about somebody potentially living in an RV. Now, my previous job in rural areas of Catawba, Burke, Caldwell County, this came up a lot. So it's good because, yeah, to your point, they were treating it as almost a livable dwelling unit, and I had to address it through minimum housing and so on. So it's nice to have language in here just in case it does pop up. And to your point, some not even thought about. Somebody's trying to rent it out for, short-term rental type stuff, but.
We normally have things, as the economy rolls up and down, we will have and experience situations. Anybody here a fan of the National Lampoon Vacation movie series where Cousin Eddie pulls up in the yard? So, you know, there's that sort of situation. And we've got in here, in other places, we've got things like campgrounds addressed. We've got things like, you know, that are covered if you're talking about a bona fide use. What this language is really speaking to is things that are getting a little out of hand in a neighborhood somewhere. And we need to define where the limit is on that out of hand. That's really what that is. That's to give Hunter and staff a reference point to be able to say, okay, you know, we're gonna need, you guys are gonna need to move this to another location. You know, it's been reported.
They're using it.
Yeah.
They're parking their RV in their front.
And a good part about this is that, once again, probably about 75 to 80% of Marvin are residential neighborhoods that have HOAs, and their HOAs are already kind of ahead of this, but you're still gonna have these one-offs and other stuff, and it's, might as well have it in here and just to make sure we have some provisions just in case.
Well, it gives you a way to back up the HOA, because if the HOA is trying to do an enforcement action, one of the things that's unfortunate in North Carolina is that the legislature has pushed back on some HOA enforcement authority. You know, right now, their largest way to collect penalties is through liens on the property, and then the ability to foreclose to collect those liens, and that's been, the legislature has pushed back on that pretty heavily. And it's always helpful if the HOA can't achieve an enforcement action that the town have, if it's within our authority, that the town have kind of a fallback underlying foundation for that policy. So let's say that they're dealing with a 10-day or 15-day thing, and it's gone on for 2 months, and they're arguing back and forth. We've got some meat on the bone. We can help, okay?
You can always make them the bad guy.
They can always make us the bad guy. That's what they pay their taxes for, right? Right, Councilman? So, I believe that's the biggest things that I wanted to point out in here. Let's see, yep, that's the biggest things that I wanted to point out in there on that one. So, if I may, I'd like to introduce now Article 17. It's sort of the tomato of the BLT, the trifecta of parking and landscape and signage. Signage regulations are the part I hate about this job the most, because it's a difficult topic. On one hand, you've got fundamental constitutional issues, speech, etc. On another hand, you've got concerns about appearance, ugly, unsightliness, things of that nature, okay? And really, in the third hand, you've got the most creative arena out there in signage. Architects, they don't touch sign people with a 10-foot pole as far as the creativity. You know, architecture is sort of limited to people that got to be able to get in and out of it or something like that. Signage doesn't have any limitations at all in terms of the creativity. So we have to establish some kind of parameters on that. So we've got really signage broken into 4 buckets. Bucket number 1 is what you typically think of as a permanent sign. Okay, it's the golden arches, or it's the monument entrance to the development, or something like that permanent signage. And we've got size and other functional criteria defined in here under permanent signage requiring a permit. And you'll see that coming in a minute. Another arena is and I'm gonna save the worst, best, whatever for last, are those things that are exempt. like when you walk up to the door of the restaurant and they've got their hours posted. Technically, that's a sign, right? So certain informational stuff might just be exempted because it's really not grabbing the motorist driving by or the neighbor. It's really when you're personally engaging the building, like walking up to the door, opening the door, things of that nature. Then we've got prohibited signs that might create public safety issues. I've had sign types before that literally had strobing lights around what was precisely a stop sign that was used by a car dealership across from a T intersection on a 4-lane road. And I personally experienced that distraction on a rainy night when I could see it far better than the real stop sign I almost went through into the 4-lane road. So that's just a little example of why you might have prohibited signs. And before I introduce the last but not least, let me remind you of a court case that really targeted local government. And the case was about 9 years ago when it ended up in the federal Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, came out of Arizona, and it was called Reed v. Gilbert. And it was based upon a church that had a sign on a donation bin, and they were asked to remove the sign that it had been there, that was prohibited, or it was prohibited or something like that. And the church promptly pointed out a sign at a business next door that was out beside a gas pump or something. And the enforcement officer made some comment, ultimately in writing, that, well, those are exempt and these are not. And the court case revolved around an administrative official like myself or Hunter, working at City Hall, having to read the sign in order to categorize and therefore apply standards. So, for example, a yard sale sign. Somebody puts up a yard sale sign down at the corner, a little one in the yard, says it's going to be a yard sale at 123 ABC Street, Saturday morning. Someone else is putting up a sign that says house for sale, and they stick it in the ground. Or they used to, way back before the internet. They'd stick up a house for sale sign. Occasionally. They'd stick up a house for sale sign, because that's back when it took more than 15, 20 minutes to sell the house, right? And those were always sort of accepted as, yeah, it can, no limit. If it takes a year to sell the property, so be it, right? And then there were a few other types of signs that are really popular right now in municipalities called "Vote for me, I'll set you free," and all that. So-and-so for mayor, so-and-so for council, right? Those political signs. So what this court case did is it instituted this foundation we'll call content neutrality, meaning we cannot use the content of the sign in order to categorize or regulate the sign. Now, that was a pretty big case, and it's almost impossible to fully comply with, but it fit the bill for that particular Reed v. Sullivan. So that last category is what I refer to, and it's where the problems generally arise, as temporary signs. Temporary signs. A temporary sign might be a yard sale sign, it might be a house for sale sign, it might be an election sign. So if you go back and pick out one of my development ordinances from 10 years ago, it would say something like yard sale signs no more than 2 square feet, can be up 7 or 10 days before the event and have to be down within 3 days of the event, something like that. And election signs could be up 45 days ahead of the polls, could be 3 square feet or whatever. had all this criteria. All that's out the window now. So in the temporary sign world, I break it down by districts, like in residential districts versus commercial districts or something like that. The sign can be so big and so tall, the kind you go out and stick in the ground or staple to a tree or whatever. But it's none of our business at Town Hall whether it says house for sale, yard sale, vote for me, whatever is your business. So we have to establish the criteria around those temporary signs a lot like we did the food truck things. Give them a duration, a time frame. So in the past, there was no limit on residential for sale sign, but there was a strict limit on yard sale sign, and even a strict limit on election signs. So now, what is it? We have to pick a set of numbers regardless of what the sign says. Now, so that's that fourth and very complicated criteria, category. There's an asterisk, a giant asterisk down here for two reasons. Number one, because I think that court case did not quite look at the extent of the use of signage in society. So in my ordinance, under the exempt signs, I do call out safety-related signs, for example, high voltage, danger, no trespassing, something like that, okay? That's category number one. So I feel like that if that ever makes it, and I've been waiting on New York or LA 1 to end up with a case up there so we could get that flushed out in there, but it hasn't happened yet. The second arena where we have to deviate from Reed v. Gilbert goes something like this. We are a political subdivision of the state in Town Hall. Local governments are a political subdivision of the state. So the state legislature is essentially our parent organization. That makes the federal government kind of like our grandparents. And uniquely, the state of North Carolina has adopted a statute, and this happened in 2013, about 2 years before Reed v. Gilbert, that specifically exempts, or allows, I should say, allows political signs inside the public right-of-way of state-maintained roads for 45 days prior to an election. So, we know that our grandparents set the ultimate rule, but our parents are breaking it. And so what do we do as the grandkids? I have a provision in here, and I want to point this out to you. So when you read it and you say, this makes no sense at all, well, I would have to agree. But it is important. Let me get to it here, because I always like to point it out. It's on page 2 under prohibited signs, and it's item G, and I snugged it into G for government. Signs erected or displayed, these are prohibited. Signs erected or displayed on or over public street right-of-ways, other than those erected by governmental agencies for which the appropriate encroachment agreements have been executed pursuant to this order, like stop, street names, whatever. Signs specifically protected by the provisions of GS 13632B are not prohibited, provided the requirements of that statute are met. So that is us basically not restricting something that the state says is allowable, even though it violates federal case law. We're just trying to keep our parents and our grandparents happy and stay out of it. So, at election time, this ordinance under temporary signs will deal with signs on private property. So if I stick up a pick a candidate sign, I can't use examples, a pick a candidate sign in my front yard, then I'm subject to whatever the number of days we have for temporary signs, whether it says the house is for sale, or vote for Rick, or yard sale Saturday. I have that right on my private property, and we've got standards in here for certain districts and other districts and other districts. So residential would be more compact. Okay? That provision G that you just read says that they can't go out and stick it in the right of way in the neighborhood. Are those town maintained? Are y'all a Powellville town? We are. Okay.
Majority of them are.
Okay, so the majority of the neighborhood streets in town are maintained by the town. Powellville is the act that reimburses the money back to the town from the gas tax to make it happen. So we can say those signs can't be in the public right-of-way. They have to be on your private property, and they can be there for however months. If you want to say 6 months or 2 months or 1 day or whatever, we pick that number. But if somebody goes out here on the main road, walks out into the right-of-way within 45 days of an election, and we're just about there now for November, and sticks a sign up that says, "Vote for Rick," in front of your house, whether you like Rick or not, and you get mad about it, and you call City Hall, Hunter cannot touch it, because the state has overridden our authority to set our own rules and standards. A state that used to be, have a lot of pride about local rule, somehow continues to say, no, 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 we know better than the town. So there is your introduction to prohibited, exempt, and then, of course, the standards that I have in here for permanent signage and then temporary signage. So if you want to, and we go through the vending machines. Vending machines include, yes, Coke, gas pumps, ATMs. Those are all vending machines, okay? And those do have signage information about them, okay? Requirements for permanent signs starts on page 6, and it starts to go into some of the stuff that goes on windows and everything else. And then the handy chart begins on page 8. And I want to use a very obvious example. On the bottom of page 9, you'll see canopy signs and awning signs, and a photograph of each.
Can I ask you a question going back to regulating, not being able to regulate content? Does, if someone were to put, you know, something that's truly offensive, curse words, sexual
Profanity.
content, profanity, on a sign and put it in a right-of-way, do we have any ability to remove it, to stop it?
We are very limited in that. Let's see. We do not address it in here at all. I couldn't remember if I did that or not. It's been a long time since I tried that, but I try to stay out of the fray on First Amendment. What do you say now? Do you have a list of words they can't say that you write in the ordinance so they can check it?
No, I'll have to go back and double check, but I want to say anything that, I mean, basically just it gets back to the whole public health, safety, and welfare language. That's a threat to that on top of, I think. it
Threatening,
Yeah. and-
foul and threatening.
And prohibits any type of signage, flag, some of that of a, you know, officially identified hate group or whatever I think it's identified as. But I would have to go back and double check. I can look into that and we can discuss it.
Well, there used to be at one time, I'm gonna give you an example, there was at one time, I believe our highway patrol largely enforced this over content on bumper stickers that were offensive and profane. And I believe that's gone now too. So, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I think we are pushing our luck based on Reed v. Gilbert and the First Amendment when it comes to trying to enforce that. Now, if it's obscene, there may be criminal rather than land use and zoning. There may be criminal. If it's threatening, intimidating, what's the word I'm looking for, where it, constitutes like a hate crime or anything like that, then there are criminal laws. See, this is all civil. So there may be some criminal things that can deal with that better than we can in here. Because our whole sign world is really about conveying information and establishing rights so that everybody's treated fairly in the different districts or types of districts. So I'm going to say I wouldn't try that in here. I think that needs to be in a criminal arena.
Just curious, so, all right, thank you.
Yeah, that's a tough one. You can see how complicated it's become for us, even though my ordinance lost about 10 pages of weight when that case came down, because I had all kinds of stuff spelled out about all, these different little types. So I want to go back to that example on page 9 then, if I may, Madam Chair. Awning and canopy. Some things require a picture. Some things, sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words when it comes to defining, and that's why those images are there. If we go back about, at least early in my career, awnings and canopies had the same privileges, and they were perceived along a lot of the same lines. But that's when people came out and pumped your gas for you. Now, it's a different world. And these big canopies for the gas stations are an entirely different arena. And so we separated those out. That's just to give you an idea of awnings and canopies so that we can tell what we're talking about here. So in the tables, you've got your third column is your copy area allowances, your illumination criteria. Is there a minimum letter size or not? Any limitations on the number of these? Like, for example, on the canopy, one per side. The Texaco's got one on this side, they got one on that side, that type of thing. And it's intended to establish some pretty fairly balanced rules. And this one is a little bit restrictive and gives the most privileges to things on the building itself, which is generally what you want to encourage, is not to have too much out along the street, the poles, or things of that nature, but to limit that a little bit and encourage things that are factored into the architecture of the building itself.
Rick, are you, in terms of these signs and the, like the square foot, like the area that it's allowed to occupy, are you basically taking our current ordinances and inputting those? So
I haven't done that. I haven't done that, but I can do that if you like what you've got. Now, I may have more categories than you do of signs. Is that would you agree?
Where are you getting your numbers from?
My numbers actually came from about 35 years ago when I first started doing this. I actually had a very good friend growing up that went to work with his brother for a sign company. And I called him one day and I said, Kent, I'd like some criteria that you guys use for what's legible at what travel speeds. So if you're going 75 miles an hour down the interstate, you probably should slow down to 70 anyway, right? If you're going 70 miles an hour down the interstate at a certain distance and a certain size sign, a certain font size for you to be able to register a message, because how many of you have been by signs where it was too small because there was too much content? And they have criteria for that. So if you look at this, most of the signs in here are really geared around small communities, not interstates. When I'm dealing with an interstate, I have some extra stuff in it that I call my interstate commerce sign overlay criteria. And I didn't even bring that to you because I know that doesn't apply here. So that's what this is based on. Now, in municipal arenas where streets are limited to 35 mile per hour speed limits unless otherwise posted, that means that our criteria is largely on the smaller scale side of things. So that's where this came from. Mr. Lavelle, did I pronounce that correctly?
You did.
Okay. That's where that information came from. The industry gave me the science that I needed to determine what will actually work. And then we kind of started working on heights and things of that nature ourselves. They didn't give us heights and whatnot. They did help me a little bit with copy area.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. So it's not out of bounds. Now, you may find an applicant from time to time that wants a bigger sign because their client has a lot of money.
But it's not only that, I think it's a standard sign, like you said, McDonald's or companies that want to have their consistency. So if you shop at a Dollar Tree here, you shop at they want to have consistency. I mean,
Right, and most of them have the designs already in play for high-standard communities, and I would consider you a high-standard community. Low-standard communities, some that don't have much, they've got some pretty standard templates as well, but then they also have those for highway settings or interstate-type settings, which are an entirely different animal. You would be shocked at how big a billboard is if you could walk up to it and stand right there in front of it, okay? And some of them at 700 square feet, 720 square feet. So that's where that information comes from, though. But play with this. The yellow numbers are all there for you to really mess with a little bit. But I'm going to tell you, I really don't think you need to go far with any of it unless you just really feel strongly that, you know, the monument signs for residential should be smaller. You know, we're saying 32. Now, keep in mind, in the very next page, page 11, defines, illustratively speaking, what the sign area is. So the architectural support, the wall, the monument itself, is not considered in the copy area. It's only the sign, how you define that. And that's also appearing in copy area's definition in the definition section, Article 3, where we define that copy area as well.
And to add on to that, that's something our current ordinance doesn't do. If you recall some of the subdivision monument signs that we've done, like I've had to break it out that way to show like what the actual lettering in the sign itself is, but like the rest of the sign's not necessarily calculated in that. I think it's 36 square feet, maybe off the top of my head, is our current for like residential monument signs. But you can look at the signage throughout Marvin. It's kind of been interpreted different ways. But now that clarifies it, because this is kind of the way that I've been doing it, because it's kind of the standard.
And that's an important aspect that Hunter brings up, is you really need your ordinance to narrow down the breadth of interpretation. You want consistent interpretation in an ordinance where it's not really debatable.
Just wondering if there's any consideration for, like, more so the Heritage District signage
So
in
that-
relation to this.
That's actually something that was kind of brought up.
But I'm looking at more in a way that I'm even considering my property, which is right next to the road, and it's a home which is supposed to be, you know, kept as a historic property there. There's very limited signage possibilities on that property, and I'm looking through all this and none of them.
Well, guess what I have for
consider
you?
That property whatsoever. I'm just asking if there's any other village-style type of signage that would be considered for the Heritage District that you might know
You'll
of.
see that in here, but I've also got a very nice little tool appearing towards the end of page 15. And this is kind of my answer to those complicated situations. And it's called the Master Sign Plan, where a project like the Heritage District could have a plan, specific plan for signage within that entire district or within an entire project, like a shopping center or something along those lines. So we've got a tool in there that, that opens the door to things like wayfinding and everything else too that might be unique to it. And we've got a process in it, and it does go through a hearing process. It does go through council. It's very engaging process. And then, of course, we've got some guidelines that follow after
I
that.
guess my question was if there's anything that's a little bit non-conforming that's not in here, can be considered under these guidelines in some way, you know, somehow, I'm sure.
Well, that's what he's saying.
Yeah.
That's what I'm
Like,
saying.
That's what
Yeah,
And-
I mean,
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
but, I mean, just to clarify too, like, that's something I've actually identified as another section that needs to be redone in the form-based code, because if you read the signage ordinance, it's kind of, it's more towards individual signage of like buildings or not necessarily like the development, like like a development identification sign, or like, what you would see like at Publix, like when, you know, they've got Publix and then the few, like, master tenants or the other big tenants that want to throw their name up there. I don't know what Publix's guidelines are on that, but we do have like, we don't necessarily clarify that in the form-based code, but that also would can then kind of comply with doing a master sign plan for a development, as they would have like, you know, their development signage and, you know, potential tenants, like, still regulate the amount of square footage of the actual signage. So it might, you know, if you have, for example, like the ZEPSA rezoning, they might have like, they're calling it Marvin Grove, and then they might have like 3 tenant, whoever their large tenants are, if it's the restaurant or something like that, and the rest of it, yeah, Marvin Grove's the name of it. But still, that's something I've been thinking through anyway, so I'm glad that we have some of those parameters in here.
One of the things that I try to do in here is treat those that are utilizing signage fairly. You will find in a form-based code, and this is a little bit problematic because we've got some form-based, which you'll be seeing in Article 9, but one of the things that the sign section tries to avoid is falling into the form-based trap. And I'll tell you what the form-based trap is. Architecturally, a sign's proportions and the proportions of the building should be in a form of balance aesthetically, correct? We all agree to that, right? If I've got a nice big Publix and my sign's bigger than the Rosario's Pizza next door, because they've got 42 feet of width in their unit and my Publix is 280 feet long. However, I hope I live long enough to see this, but my prediction is that those regulations are going to be stricken at the court level, because they equate your ability to speak to your wealth or the property you control. And I don't believe that that would pass a litmus test. I believe that that would be considered a privilege that someone else can't enjoy unless they've got a big building too. So the way this ordinance is written is those are all treated equally. That's where the master sign plan can come into play, so they can weigh it out against the architecture and make that decision, and it goes through a public process, and the council would have to act on approving it, things of that nature. It's not just something where Hunter gives the pizza place a bigger privilege than the hair place, okay? So that's a fundamental thing that I've always been a little bit nervous about, so I work around that with the master plan for signage. Wall signs, yes, right.
So it says 32 square feet.
That's right.
So 1,200 square foot, the 1,200 square foot space gets the same as a 4,800 square foot space?
Yeah.
And that's actually how it is in Marvin Gardens. It says that, and it actually kind of reads awkward, and I've talked to our attorney about the actual, once again, kind of interpretation, but it says, you know, your total square footage is or signs allowed is like 1 square foot for every linear footage of building front.
Right.
And then it has a max of 36 square feet. And the way it reads, it's kind of interesting, because the way it reads, it's like, are you interpreting that it's just 36 across the board? Because that's kind of, I mean, pretty straightforward. Or is it like, if your building is bigger, are you allowed to technically have a bigger sign? We've just been interpreting as 36 square feet across the board, boom, done.
That's
But-
probably smart.
Yeah.
But how is that, though? I mean, why should a 1,200 square foot building have the same sign as a 48? It's 4
Because-
times the size. And we talked architecturally, it's gonna be very easy to see that sign of 32 square feet on a 1,200, but very hard to see it on a 4,800 square feet.
Well, it's my contention that that is a potential constitutional issue over equating the property you control to your ability to
But
speak.
it's not now, though.
Well, it's not now, but, yeah.
So, I mean, we have the ability to regulate it how we want right now. We don't have to worry about a constitutional, we can't do it as a constitutional, which may or may not come up.
That's
I mean,
right.
The good thing is that we're not gonna be approving another Publix again, but I mean, it does seem, I mean, I get the whole equity issue. I work in equity every single day, but if you've got an anchor tenant who's bringing business in, you're not gonna give them, I mean, it just,
Well,
it just.
And that's where the
it's just
master
too
sign
far.
plan comes in.
Yeah.
Yes, correct.
That's exactly where that comes in.
For public specifically.
And it describes that.
Right. I mean, but I'm saying, do we have the ability if, you know, if in one of those 2 large parcels that are designated commercial, we have the ability to allow a bigger sign like we did with Publix?
Correct. With Publix, the signage for Publix, like in their ICD language, they're broken up into envelopes. Envelope A is specifically like the Publix building, and then like the rest of the commercial and the out parcels are like envelope B. It's kind of confusing, but basically it says like the signage in envelope A allowed is what was basically approved with the conditional zoning. So they did a master signage plan for Publix. That was the sign that's the signage stuff that got incorporated into their rezoning and their approval. Because yes, Publix does have a bigger sign than anybody else on that, like at the out parcels or even the additional tenant spaces, but that was specifically approved that way.
And this works, if you read the procedure part on page 16 and 17, this basically functions like a conditional zoning, except you're not rezoning the land. You're not establishing zoning across the whole property. You're dealing with specifics of signage only, and so it goes to the planning board, then it would go to the council, okay?
It's still similar to like our current design review board process with this. Because, you know, for example, what was it, Dunkin' Donuts? You know, we reviewed their 2 wall-mounted signs. However, they complied with the ordinance, so it said like, you know, those could be administratively approved. The only thing that we were technically you guys were reviewing from a DRB standpoint was that one little directional sign that said drive through this way. But it's still, it's kind of that same process, but at a little bit, you know, greater scale for the whole signage of the whole development.
Yeah, they have to do a public hearing, in this one, you'd have to do a public hearing and everything, go to the planning board, do a public hearing, do all of that before the council could approve it. So it's essentially not a conditional zoning, but it's a conditional approval of a master sign plan for that specific situation. So you legislate it, that's the whole point, rather than be subjective about it. You essentially create that plan for that property specifically, okay? And that's why I break that out, because I understand where you're coming from, that that's not been cast into the case law yet, but from where I sit, it's a candidate for it, and I'm surprised it hasn't gone there yet. And that's why I recommend I'm always going to steer you on the safe side. I'm not going to take you out there and say, well, you know, nobody's been sued yet, but you could try it. I don't ever recommend those kinds of policies.
And yeah, if you guys, like I said, look on page 16, and if you look under review procedure,
Yeah.
page 16, review
the
procedure.
procedure.
The last sentence in that first paragraph says, in reviewing the proposed master signing plan, the planning board and council shall take the following matters into consideration. And basically, it's going over if they're proposing to deviate, so if it's 32 square feet and they're proposing something larger, this is kind of the parameters where it's like, planning board reviews it, and then council reviews it and makes their consideration kind of based off of those parameters.
That's how you legislate something in.
Yes.
Yep. You have a process. But it doesn't have just some other number that's just based on something. Yeah.
And that's better than what's currently we do, because, for example, Dunkin' wanted, they were allowed 2 wall-mounted signs, and they were originally trying to go for 3. I talked with Dunkin' Donuts, just because of the way that building sits, you know, they have one at the front and one over here, and now the back of the building, and I think they should have one. But the current ordinance base, or what the ordinance states, is that it still has to go through DRB process, but DRB can't allow like a deviation, like an additional sign and stuff like that. So I told Duncan they have to go through a text amendment process.
So all the normal standards are applied by staff, which is an administrative determination, okay? These other things are done by council, which is a legislative act. You follow me? So there's not any, there's a total separation from the two, okay? All right, well, I wanted to introduce that to you. Get that out on the table, and then we'll be taking a look at that at the next meeting. Now, in my calendar that we worked up a few months ago, I had that we had talked about by now, hopefully you would have more room on your regular meeting date, so I do not have anything extra for 2 nights from now for Thursday night, even though we had held that date back if we needed it.
I will mention, probably in October, November, we're gonna have a major sketch plan on the agenda.
In
It's-
October?
Yeah, but it's a 5-lot subdivision. It's a 5-lot subdivision. The only reason it's classified as a major is because they're putting in a road.
Testing, testing. Yes, we got it.
We will potentially have a major subdivision sketch plan on the agenda in either October or November. But it's not your typical major subdivision. It's a 5-lot subdivision. The only reason why it's got to go through the major process is because they are proposing to install a road. No. So in short, I foresee we can probably still have that on the agenda and this, because I don't think that's going to take longer than 30 minutes. Yeah.
So I have scheduled for the 17th for the October, and then the 19th is an alternate date, but then on November, we do not have an alternate date because of Thanksgiving being the same week as your regular meeting, so I have the 21st. That's that schedule that everybody should have in their little notebooks. So right now, I'm aiming to be here on the 17th, unless you tell me there's a lot on the agenda and I should come on the 19th.
No, I think we're good for the 17th. Like I said,
Okay.
there just might be one other thing on the agenda, but we should be able to get through it within 30 minutes.
All right.
I'm waiting for the nod. Slow your horses down, Mr. Lavelle. Do we have any additional business that we need to take care of before we get a motion to adjourn? Or do we need, if we're doing MD Development Ordinance, MDO, do we need to do roundtable comments?
Well, I do have a brief planners update. One, we have an intern that has started with us. If you haven't met her, her name's Palomi. I'm gonna Polomi. She started about 2 weeks ago. She's interning mainly under me, but she's also still helping out with some stuff with Austin and Tyler, our parks coordinator. So get a chance, say hey to her. We're kind of actually going over tomorrow, like the actual internship length and how long she'll be here. But she's been a great help so far. She's learning a lot, and happy to have her. And the only other update that I have is, once again, potential major subdivision. So it may be on the agenda. We had a preliminary call with him today. It's one that I really think shouldn't really have to go through this lengthy process, but it is. Other than that, unless any of the board members have any specific questions.
How about any updates on the roundabout opening day?
I'll let you know when I can drive on it.
She'll be the first one.
How's the
Believe me,
Did I miss
my,
something?
well, no, just that, like, it takes forever for anyone in my neighborhood to get in or out, and deliveries are like,
Rick, good night.
thank you, Rick.
I'm trying to rent my house.
What's the progress? Is it at like 40%, 60%?
So the estimated date right now is mid to late October. That is if people cannot drive through the site. I've had to send out reminders that that's illegal and you will be fined and ticketed.
Tried tonight, it's really hard.
They-
Oh, okay, yeah.
They've
He
started
was
parking,
navigating.
they started parking their, like, vehicles, like, on the edges so people can't get through.
So we got them. So yeah, that's $500. If you move a barricade, it's $500 more dollars if you drive beyond the barricade.
Yeah, we have drivers, like delivery people who are refusing to go through the barriers to deliver things to our homes. Like, we've had to go out and meet like Grubhub at the Circle, like it's been ridiculous. Yeah, so,
It's coming along though, so
Yes, it is.
pending any inclement weather or damage caused by irresponsible drivers, mid to late October.
yeah, they actually I saw them setting the concrete form, or, like the structure around to pour for the actual center. So whatever those construction terms are, but, yeah, all right, cool. Well, welcome. Thank you. And anyone have any comments, questions, thoughts, confessions before we adjourn? Michael Lavelle would like to move to adjourn. Does he have a second?
I'm not the
All-
only one.
All in favor? All right, so moved. Thanks, everybody.